Great, thank you. It's an honor for us to be with you tonight here in Jerusalem. Professor Neil Ferguson is a world-renowned historian, public intellectual, who thankfully does not need introduction to our audience. Good evening, Professor Ferguson. And tonight we'd like to pleasure to be with you. Tonight we would like to discuss the place of religion in the public sphere. Given that recently you've made some comments on yourself being a lapsed Christian. A lapsed atheist, and you've become sort of a conspicuously pro-religious voice, a voice positive on religion. So let me begin with an argument and ask your opinion on this argument. In the Bible, where can one discover divinity? So God reveals himself in speech, then written in books, to a man who is in his image. And in Genesis, the image is a male and female. Then to a nation with whom he has relations across history and in a sacred geography. All of these together combine to form a sacred polity. That is my proposition. Now, today, none of this is legitimate. Speech is power, marriage is in decline, the nation and the Holy Land are both forbidden concepts, and therefore Western politics are avowedly secular. So do you support or reject this proposition? In essence, is there a political Christianity today?
Well, this is a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a kind of series of steps. Step one is that I think the concept of political Christianity is itself a contradiction in terms, because Christ tells us to distinguish religion from politics in a way that Muhammad does not. And the notion of rendering up unto Caesar is as important in this context as the fundamental division, especially in Western Christianity, between the church and the state, between the spiritual and temporal realms. So I would be wary of anybody who said I'm a political Christian, even although that has been a successful formula in some countries. Christian democracy, after all, is one of the ways in which Western Europe repaired itself politically after World War II. So that's my first step. My second step is, as a lapsed atheist, as somebody who was brought up an atheist, not who converted to atheism, but was raised one, I have come to realize that it's extremely difficult to run a society on atheism. And indeed, one of the lessons I learned as a historian more than 10 years ago is that all experiments to base a social and political order on atheism have ended catastrophically. Think of the experiments with a post-Christian or non-Christian order in the French Revolution. Think of the Bolshevik attack on the Russian Orthodox Church. Think of the hostility to Christianity that's characterized Mao's regime and indeed continues to characterize the Chinese Communist Party. So I think the first observation is that societies that are avowedly atheist don't come out well. They tend to be characterized by high levels of political violence, in fact. And then the third step I would take is that it turns out to be quite difficult to run a life, an individual life, or a family life without religion. And I think in particular to raise children without religion is an extraordinarily difficult undertaking. Where does one get the ethical framework from? How do you teach children the difference between good and evil? I mean, you could perhaps make it up from first principles, but it's a lot harder to do that than to introduce them to time-honored ideas of good and evil, time-honored ideas of social and familial order, whether from the Old Testament or from the New. I am a Philosemite. That's not a much used term. I'm somebody who reveres Judaism. Let me be more precise. And I think Judaism shows us in many ways the great benefits of having a religious order to one's life, for one's family, for oneself. And I think Christianity offers comparable, though different, benefits to the individual and to the family. And I would say to the wider society too. So for that reason, I've come to believe in God, because I think not believing in God is a bad choice for the individual, for the family, and for a wider society.
Could you please elaborate what exactly is the problem of like raising a family without God or not believing in God as a society?
Well, let's think about the family situation first. I have 5 children, and they range in ages from 30 down to 6. At no point in my career as a father did I think that I could dispense with some kind of religious education. And although I didn't believe at the time I first became a father, I felt it was important to take the children to church when they were old enough and to send them to a school in which there were assemblies, there was some religious content. Now, you can think about this partly as a typical British desire for the familiar rituals of Christmas. It could be no more than that. But in my case, it was more than that. I felt that there needed to be some religious instruction for the children so that they would at least understand the culture in which they were growing up, and also learn what can be learned from the Old and New Testaments. It's part of being an educated person. That was my initial thought. But it's also easier to explain the difference between good and evil with the Bible to back one up. It's harder to do it from first principles, though I've no doubt that there are people who've done this successfully. I think if you want to get children to understand what a good decision looks like, what a bad decision looks like, then it's very helpful to have the full range of stories that the Bible offers to draw on. The other thing is that if you can find a good clergyman, whether it's a good minister, priest, or rabbi, that helps too, because it means that the parents aren't having to do all the heavy lifting. There is some other person that you can refer your children to, or that your children will hear from, whether it's in the church or in the synagogue. So I started doing this before I became a religious believer. I only really became a Christian in faith and observance very recently. But as a father, I always felt that it had to be part of the upbringing of all my children, and that sort of illustrates the lack of confidence I had in atheism 30 years ago when I started out on this journey.
Very interesting. So as a historian, is religion for you? Do you do religion only outside of work hours, or do you do religion during, in the office? Is history the hand of God in any way? Or conversely, was secularization? How do you use secularization as a historian?
הרבה הורים מודאגים לגבי הברית, גם לגבי האווירה, וגם לגבי, כמובן, העניין הרפואי, שלא יהיו סיבוכים ולא יהיו בעיות. רציתי להמליץ לכם על המוהל אברהם יצחק פיירמן, שהוא גם חובש רפואת חירום מוסמך, וגם יש לו יכולת ככה להרים את האווירה ואת הקהל, ואולי הכי טוב לספר לכם דרך המשוב של משפחת עטיה, שאמרה שהייתה תחושה של ביטחון להורים, יחד עם שמחה, חיות ויראת שמיים. אז אם יש לכם ברית בקרוב, אז דבר ראשון מזל טוב, ודבר שני, תתקשרו ל-058-630-1851, אברהם יצחק פיירמן. אז תתקשרו ותודו לי אחר כך, תגידו לי איך היה.
Well, I think there are two answers to that question. One is a philosophical one. I have always been interested in the philosophy of history, and I've wanted to try to make my students understand that what we're doing is not simple and requires some philosophical foundations. The idea that there is some deterministic plan, some predictable historical sequence, is a very powerful one. one finds it in Christian historiography, and one also finds it in its opposite, in Marxist historiography. In many ways, what Marx did with his historical dialectic was to take ideas from Christianity mostly and kind of repackage them as a theory of the way the world works, with Hegel and Ricardo thrown into the mix. I started out my career very skeptical about deterministic theories of history, whether they were divinely ordained or ordained by Karl Marx. And in a book called Virtual History, I tried to argue that in reality, the historical process was characterized by complexity and by chaos, and that one couldn't really expect there to be predictable cycles of history or any kind of plan with predictable outcomes. That probably aligned quite well with my early way of thinking about the world, but it implied an important thing, which was free will. If one dispenses with deterministic models of history, one realizes that the individual does have agency, that free will is not a delusion, as Tolstoy suggests it is at the end of War and Peace, but a reality, and that our individual decisions can have massive consequences in the same way that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazonian rainforest can cause a hurricane in distant Texas. So in arguing that we live in a complex and chaotic world, one way of putting this is it's particles with consciousness, so it's even more complex than the natural world. One also arrives at the insight that the human has agency, that the human being has free will, and therefore that the decisions we take matter, and good and bad decisions have consequences. So that's quite for me, an unanticipated consequence of thinking about the world philosophically in the way that I have done. My mother is a physicist, my sister is a physicist. I'm a sort of renegade, repressed physicist, and I tend to think of history as particles with consciousness. The second point I would make is that when you're contemplating modern history, but one could say the same of ancient history and indeed medieval history, one contemplates a lot of suffering. Indeed, much of the study of the past is the study of calamities, some man-made, some natural. One reads endlessly, it feels like, about human suffering. Books that I've written have tackled the First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust. I've written a good deal about the Jewish experience in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm constantly confronting suffering in different times amongst people in different various situations from my own. And it seems to me that as you do that, you have to ask yourself, is it all just randomness and luck? Or can there be some redeeming meaning in the suffering that I'm encountering, that I'm reading about, that I'm reimagining, and that I'm then writing about? And that's the question that I wrestle with much more now than I did early in my career. It's hard to contemplate, for example, the 1970 disaster in what became Bangladesh, but was then East Pakistan, and say to oneself, this is the divine plan at work. There were people who said that about the Irish famine in the 1840s, and we really write very harsh words about those people who said that it was providence, that it was the working of the divine plan that people were starving to death in Ireland. So it's a difficult thing for me to say there must be some divine purpose when millions are starving and children are dying. I'm not there yet. And I've come to the somewhat lame conclusion that we can't understand this divine plan. It's in the nature of our limitations as humans with human consciousness that we can't really understand what God is about, and the attempt to do so is a slightly vainglorious one.
Yes, it's fascinating that you took the conversation in this direction, because arguably the most prominent historiographer in the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Ramchal, he dwelled precisely on this question, on how to explain evil across history and square it with monotheism, with God's omnipotence.
How does he solve the problem? Because I haven't read his
work.
work.
So it's interesting because he lived a very tragic life in Padua at the 18th century, and it's interesting that in the end, he is a fanatical optimist. He was an artist and he wrote plays that are romantic plays, very optimistic character. And in the end, he comes to a conclusion that we can only understand so much of what God's plan is until the end of days, until the judgment day. But for him, it was the great mystery of monotheism. Monotheism in essence was not just a numerical proposition of one God versus many. It was being able to show God's hand in everything, even in the most profound forms of evil. That was exactly what the question that preoccupied him.
So interesting, and I hope at the end of this you'll send me some readings because it's been a source of disquiet for me that the ancients didn't have to grapple with, because in a polytheistic world, you just assume that the terrible things are happening because the gods are having a fight. But with one God, it gets much harder. So thanks for that reference. Part of my enthusiasm for religion is that I've never tired of educating myself. And as somebody who's been bluffing on both Judaism and Christianity for 60 years, it's about time that I got to be less of a bluffer.
So we don't consider you as one. And actually, I'd like to ask you about if the West is in trauma from religion. And if so, when did it start with trauma of wanting to get far away from religion as possible and building a more secular society?
Well, it's of course a feature of modernity that the first sustained questioning of religion was in the Enlightenment, where one saw skepticism going all the way beyond deism into outright unbelief. But that was really the pursuit of relatively few intellectuals who were constrained by the laws of the time from what they could say and write. It's much more meaningful in the later 19th century that followers of Marx can openly disavow religious faith without facing dire consequences. And I think one can therefore trace the institutionalization and spread of unbelief to Marx and the spread of social democracy as a political ideology, which didn't require people to lose their religious faith, but strongly implied that religion was the opium of the masses and that you should probably stop taking that opium. In the 20th century, the more powerful Marxist regimes became, the more sustained the assaults on religious belief. I think it's sometimes forgotten how violently the Bolsheviks went after the church when they were fighting the civil war and establishing their rule throughout the Russian Empire. And so I think the 20th century sees these explicitly godless regimes that are engaged in an explicit war against organized religious observance and faith. The process whereby that seeps into the non-communist world is interesting, because it's partly that it seeps through the academic channel. It's not that every professor is a Marxist, it's just that quite a lot of them are Marxists by the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And if you've got Marxists on the faculty, you've certainly got tolerant liberals. And the liberals, who after all hire the Marxists, are often agnostics. That's to say, they don't really have strong religious belief, and they're a bit embarrassed if they have any at all. That's true of Christian liberals and Jewish liberals, who I think are accessories to this process of secularization that we're talking about. Then, of course, you just have the changes in the life of ordinary people who don't necessarily go to university or even read books, but are catapulted from villages into cities. And the transition from the village to the city is one that allows a significant unmooring. You couldn't not go to church in a village in Europe. It was a sure way to get yourself identified as an outcast, perhaps even a witch. But if you're in the city, it's pretty hard to provide enough religious capacity to meet the needs of an urban population. And then, of course, there are the other things to do. And I think the sheer variety of other things to do that characterizes the last 100 years is the best explanation for the fact that even in the United States, which held out for a long time, secularization has manifested itself as decline in religious faith, decline in religious observance, and a concomitant increase in other activities, which in times of the day or the week that previously people devoted to religion. That's a very long-winded answer, but that's my story of secularization. And who resisted it? I mean, the people who resisted it were evangelicals. The people who resisted it were those who tried to mobilize their church or their religious faith against the tide of secularism. There were Jews who did that. There were Christians, Roman Catholics, and Protestants who did that. And of course, there were Muslims who did it. And the odd thing is that the most aggressive counter-revolution against secularization was organized by Muslims, not by Jews or Christians.
So if I understand you correctly, let me just summarize before I move to the next question. In the realm of communism, I think it's safe to say that the departure from religion was traumatic, and the process of healing, I guess, has begun, but I don't know, if it's been completed. That's the first step, right? Am I correct on that? Yeah, and then in the West,
I think it's let me qualify it. The ideology of Marxism carries with it clear discouragement of religious faith and observance. When that's institutionalized in the communist regime, that becomes a formal prohibition. And being, for example, in East Germany, being part of the Protestant church there was to some extent to make yourself an object of suspicion by the regime. And in some communist societies, it wasn't tolerated at all.
yes, but in the West, if I understood you correctly, you take the position of around here, Yuval Noah Harari has this position that religion simply petered into irrelevance. People just found better things to do with their time. That's what general society did, right? So my next question
Yes,
is, so
I
if
do.
that's
Yeah.
yes,
That's
so
not
if
a
that's
particularly original analysis. That's kind of the standard historical account of secularization going all the way back
yes, but
as far as Chadwick.
oh, okay, yes, but so if you take this from a contemporary standpoint, many people have pointed out, such as Jonathan Haidt, prominently, that woke in many ways is a new religion, even a fundamentalist religion, a fundamentalist superstition, if you may. And so do you think that it's basically a God-shaped hole in people's heart, that they are filling an existential void with this woke? And the last part of this question would be, have they in essence replaced religion with a form of idolatry, with a form of fake religion, of perverse religion?
Yes, but before we go further, let's remember that the process of creating false religions or new religions, political religions, goes a long way back. Michael Burley has written excellently on this. In many ways, National Socialism and socialism in one country in the mid-20th century were just religions made up to take the place of Christianity. And it's very striking that so much of the iconography as well as the rhetoric of Nazism was pseudo-religious. Burley writes very well on this, showing the extent to which the Nazis deliberately tout Christian ideas, language, iconography, in creating their own pseudo-religion around the cult of Hitler and the Aryan race. And there's a similar process in the Soviet Union. So it turns out that from the minute that men try to discard religion, they almost immediately embrace some new religion, which they dignify as a political ideology to make themselves feel better. There's no doubt that G.K. Chesterton did not say this. He did not say this, but it's a pity. He should have. And the quote is, the trouble with atheism is not that men believe in nothing, it's that they believe in anything. So this is, I think, a kind of clear leitmotif over 100 years. And wokeism is just the latest version of this. Now, wokeism is recognizably a kind of religion, a pseudo-religion, because it has all the kind of trappings of a cult. You have a different kind of language that normal people don't use. You engage in strange rituals like announcing your pronouns, and you use different rituals to reinforce the membership of the cult. My wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, pointed this out in a brilliant article some years ago now in the Wall Street Journal, saying that Islam and wokeism were almost twins separated at birth in the way that they go about things. For example, the casting out of heretics and the pursuit of blasphemers. This is a very big part of what woke people spend their lives doing. There's nothing more satisfying than cancelling somebody who has transgressed from the doctrine of wokery. And so this is, I think, a really clear way to understand what we're up against when we encounter radical progressive people in universities and elsewhere. The idea that there's a great awakening, I think, was first Matt Iglesias's, but it's one of the great catchlines of our time, because the great awakening is like the great awakenings of American Christian history, going right back to the late 18th century. And it's just the latest manifestation. Indeed, you could say that there's something of the old Puritan Protestant sectarianism in the way that people behave when they get caught up in wokery. There is perhaps some conscious echo of the more radical Protestant sects of the 17th and 18th century.
But to me, just 1 second, Tamir. To me, the surprising part, the astounding part of the proposition of the Red-Green Alliance is the green side, because in essence, if you look at if you take the most radical forms of political Islam, if it's ISIS or Hamas, these people are in essence, it's a death cult, kind of biblical Molech. It's even worse. They're actually sacrificing not their own children, but other people's children. They're abusing not their own women, but other people's women. It's like a monotheistic idolatry. So that's, to me, the most startling part. And if you want to take the argument to its full conclusion, it's that the Hindus, who are ostensibly pagans, they seem to be on the right side of the civilizational argument.
Yes, this is one of the great puzzles of our time, the militant Islamists who want to focus on the Prophet's teaching at Medina have made a strange alliance with the progressive left. They outwardly have nothing in common. And indeed, if one really left woke types in an Islamist regime for any length of time, they would swiftly be jailed and quite probably put to death. Hence the puzzle of Queers for Palestine as a sign and a demonstration. But there are so many different ways in which this manifests itself. I used to worry that I couldn't work it. I couldn't work it out. I couldn't understand why these two so different groups would make common cause. And then I understood that they did have certain common interests. Hatred of America is a common variable. A deeper liberalism, a desire to police and restrict what can be said. And for the Islamists, the woke are the useful idiots who can be used to gain their objectives, especially in campuses, but also elsewhere, because they can count on the progressive left to agree, for example, to censorship they can count on the progressive left to say, whenever there's an Islamist terrorist attack, that we should really be worried about the right-wing backlash to the attack and not about the attack itself. So there's actually quite a bit of common ground there, but it's clear who's using whom, I think, and it's also clear what the fate would be of woke progressives who inadvertently brought a Sharia regime to power where they lived, just as the left in Iran didn't understand what would happen to them when they made a common cause with Khomeini. So the woke don't understand what will happen to them if ultimately there is a kind of soumission. If you get the Welbeck moment when a Western society actually capitulates to the Islamists, the first people to be jailed and thrown off buildings will be the radical left.
Yeah, especially because they don't carry weapons. They're against self-defense. But to be more honest, I would like to ask you about Yoram Hazony book, Conservatism and Rediscovery. He writes in his book that in the 60s, religion and faith were banned from schools in the United States. So a new generation of secular kids is not going to, or maybe sons of religious Christian kids that can't afford to send their children to private school are denied from even knowing about their culture, about their heritage and their faith. What do you think are the implications of getting rid of religion from the public sphere and from schools?
I mean, as I mentioned, sent my children to schools where there were religious services, and I did that even as an atheist. It's all very well to have what the French call laïcité, to secularize your public schools, but you can only do it successfully if there is a pretty good system of religious education available through churches. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, when all of these ideas gathered momentum with the teachers and educators generally, there was still a pretty robust system of religious education in most states in the United States. And indeed, religious communities were very active parts of life in the America that Charles Murray writes about in Coming Apart. The problem is that it turned out that that system of, if you like, religious social life couldn't, in fact, survive alone if the education system became wholly secular. The other problem is that if you do remove religion from schools, something takes its place. And what happened was that a variety of liberal, progressive, and even Marxist ideas simply moved in. And the best illustration of this I can give is the number of American school kids these days who are taught American history with the writings of Howard Zinn, an ardent leftist whose view of American history has now become mainstream, but was once the radical critique of the conventional narrative. So I do think it's right that secularizing American education had unintended consequences, just in the same way that allowing teachers to unionize had unintended consequences, because the teachers' union is probably the single most bitter opponent of not just religious belief, but Western civilization that now exists in the United States. And it enjoys a power that is simply breathtaking. And that wasn't really meant to happen. And it certainly wasn't meant to deliver the teaching profession to the progressive left, but it has had that effect.
So, actually, in Israel, back then, in the days about 100 years ago, they have a protocol when they write that the teachers' union of the Histadrut, of the early Zionist movement, they say that they want to raise a generation which will be anti-intellectual. So maybe it was something they wanted to happen.
Yes, I think many of the ideas of 100 years ago turned out to be very bad ideas indeed. And, the list is long. It's funny, if we had a time machine and we went back to 1924, we'd be astounded to find that all the leading intellectuals were convinced believers in eugenics. And it was a very, very bad time for good ideas, the 1920s, and a great time for bad ideas.
Yeah, well, you are now you're a co-founder of a new university at Austin, Texas, which I believe has just begun. It's beginning in this semester, opening the first. Yes. So
The
congratulations.
first
We wish you.
students will arrive on September the 9th, where we'll begin the first academic year of the new university, 3 years after we had the idea, which is a pretty quick turnaround for a new college.
Mazal Tov, we wish you a great success. We think there's a lot depending on your success. So I want to ask you if you discussed education and secularized and forced secularization in education. Universities used to be religious institutions, and what will be done different at Austin University? You're getting some very bright young students who want something different. What will you give them different?
Well, we have taken the decision not to have any religious affiliation. There are Christian universities, Hillsdale, for example. We want to be able to attract Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu students. We really want to have as broad a range of students from that point of view as possible. So it's not going to have the University of Austin chapel, excuse me, as it would if we were founding it in the 15th century in Oxford or Cambridge. And I think that's the only way really to do it. And therefore we must make it easy for our students to go to worship as they wish. And we will certainly be making sure that that's possible. The university's goal is to permit the fearless pursuit of truth, not just to permit it, but to encourage it. We are an institution with a constitutional commitment to academic freedom. You will pursue truth wherever the path leads you, and to meritocracy. We will make our decisions about admissions, about hiring and promoting on the basis of academic potential and performance, not on the basis of race or religion. So we're consciously building a structure somewhat like that of the United States itself. And indeed, when I sat down to draw up a constitution for the University of Austin, the first thing I did was to start with the Constitution of the United States and adapt whatever I could from that constitution to the needs of the new university. So that's our role model, and therefore we've adopted essentially the US concept that there should not be an ordered a college religion.
Very interesting. So let me just ask, one of the biggest questions that I can, since universities, try to get to the deepest, introduce their students to the deepest questions they can. We're talking about civilization. Let me talk about inter-civilizational dialogue, because in ancient times it was not really possible. You could have Ibn Khaldun or Marco Polo traveling the world and writing and bringing back artifacts, but a large-scale inter-civilizational dialogue was not really possible. I could never, until very recently, I could never read in the same day a current newspaper from South America and India and China all in the same day, or travel to these places extensively. So, do you think the United States Constitution is a constitution of one civilization? Do you think that now we can work on civilizational dialogue, or never the twain shall meet?
We absolutely need to make sure that the civilizations meet. Part of the characteristic feature of a civilization is that it has rather blurred edges and is not a homogeneous thing at all. So in the way in which we have set up the intellectual foundations program for our first year students, they read not only from the literature and science of the Western world, but they also will be reading from other civilizations. We skew towards the Judeo-Christian tradition because we are, I think, consciously an institution committed to the ideals of Western civilization, because it was Western civilization that came up with the idea that one should pursue truth fearlessly, and that the purpose of a university should in fact be the acquisition of knowledge with minimal restraints. But we want our students to understand Islam. We want them to have some grasp, for example, of the Confucian tradition, which of course has influenced the lives of a fifth, slightly less than a fifth now of humanity. And I think the ideal undergraduate education is capable of reaching between civilizations in just the same way that the great Enlightenment thinkers tried all the time to think outside their civilizational lanes. It's amazing that people like Adam Smith or Adam Ferguson wrote about China. They'd never been to China. Montesquieu has the same relationship to Persia. Everybody's trying to understand.
Excuse me, we saw. I mean, I just wanted to interject. We saw where that led James Mill.
But this is part of what makes the Enlightenment interesting.
Excuse me.
So I think what's fascinating about the modern period is that essentially the Western or Judeo-Christian ideas that were deeply rooted in Europe go abroad, and they go abroad partly to build empires, partly to engage in missionary activity, partly to do scientific research. But these encounters between West and East are absolutely crucial in the whole process that we think of as modernization. And so any university that wants to help people understand where they've come from and where they may go to has to capture that reality. And that doesn't mean just getting people to read Edward Said, because I don't think Orientalism is the kind of book that I want the students to attach too much importance to. I do want them to understand, though, that a great deal of what emerges in the 20th century and is recognizably the modern world is the result not of a hermetically sealed Western civilization, but rather the result of encounters between the West and the rest, or the West and the East. That's been a recurrent theme of my work going back to the book Civilization, and the course that I taught at Harvard with Maya Jasanoff many years ago now, in which we essentially gave Western global history as a series of encounters, a series of microcosmic encounters between the West and the non-West.
That's fascinating, because the way it's usually explained is Huntington seeing the clash of civilizations merely as a problem, not as a solution. It was never something that could be solved through polite dialogue.
I disagreed with that book from the moment of its publication, and tried to show that most of the conflicts of certainly the modern era are within civilizations, not between them, and that civilizations, unlike empires, have these very blurred edges. And much of what makes a civilization creative usually comes from importing knowledge, literature, art from another civilization. The bagpipes are a musical instrument associated with Scotland, where I come from, but they originated, of course, in the Holy Land and were brought back from the Crusades and adopted to use on the Celtic periphery. I think the historian who does his job right understands that civilizations are more likely to fuse than to clash, and that most conflicts arise from the narcissism of small differences rather than from profound civilizational cleavages. Ultimately, what is the Renaissance after all? It's a rediscovery, it's a rebooting of Europe with ideas that had essentially been lost following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and they'd only really survived in part because of the relative flourishing of the Islamic world. So I think we need to understand the fluidity of the history of civilizations, and in that I think Sam Huntington's book was quite deeply flawed.
So if we are talking about clashes, I'd like to ask you about the place of non-Christians in your religion, in your religious point of view.
So I'm not the kind of Christian who wants to convert others to Christianity. I in fact have a huge reverence for Judaism, having studied a number of important subjects in Jewish history, not least the history of the Rothschilds, who were in many ways the kind of most famous Jewish family of the 19th and much of the 20th century. I think one of the triumphs of the modern age has been the way in which Christians and Jews have found their way to peaceful coexistence. The very notion of Judeo-Christian civilization, which was a coinage of the Cold War, would have seemed mad if you tried to use it as recently as the 1920s, when most people would have said they're quite distinct things. How could you possibly yoke them together? But we've successfully done that, and it's a cause for celebration. I even attended a wedding recently in Buenos Aires that was a mixed Roman Catholic Jewish wedding between a Roman Catholic bridegroom and a Jewish bride. So we've achieved something that eluded the Western world for centuries, and that is a real accommodation and coexistence of Christians and Jews. The problem is Islam, and that's been clear now for many decades, certainly since the 1970s. And when I say it's a problem, what I mean is that because of Islam's claims not to recognize a distinction between religion and politics, between mosque and state, it's very, very hard for it to coexist with Christian and Jewish societies which recognize some distinction between religion and the realm of politics. And it wouldn't matter so much were it not for the fact that there are a really large number of organizations which are still very well funded that are committed to proselytizing, radicalizing, and empowering Islam in societies where Muslims only recently began to live in large numbers. And that, of course, is creating conflicts in ways that were predictable long ago. And one sees on a fairly regular basis that these conflicts are not going away, and indeed may conceivably escalate. My wife wrote an important book about the possibility of an Islamic Reformation, or perhaps it might have been Enlightenment. There must be some possibility that Islam evolves to become more capable of coexisting with other faiths. Perhaps it's just a matter of time, or perhaps the underlying operating system just won't admit of that. We don't know. There are Muslim reformers in numbers that one didn't really see before. And I think if you asked her, she would say that relative to 10 years ago, there has been real progress, particularly because in the Gulf, as well as in Egypt, there's been an understanding that you can't, in fact, have give too much ground to the Islamists that actually undo the established order in Muslim majority countries. So I sense that in her eyes, as a former Muslim turned atheist and now converted to Christianity, there's some reason for cautious optimism. But it's very early days, and the forces that promote intolerance, violence, want to face Israel from the map, those forces are still very powerful and well resourced. So I'm not expecting in my lifetime to see this fundamental tension between Islam and the rest of the world to see it resolved.
So if I may add a closing remark before I take two brief questions from the audience. You were talking to two religious Zionists, to two what you'd call in America modern Orthodox Jews, and we oppose the separation of religion and state. We would not want to enforce our religion by force. We wouldn't want to do that. There would be no mutawa, religious police, or anything like that. But we would not want religion separated from state. We would also, you mentioned the intermarriage. We wouldn't force our opinions on anyone, but we do not approve of intermarriage, of religious syncretism in general. When I see someone like J.D. Vance and his wife Usha, I can only imagine them as two very fine individuals, very accomplished and high achieving. But I ask myself what their marriage means for the tradition, for their children. Those are the kind of questions that I ask myself. I'll just say that as closing remarks. So in that sense, I'm not. I am zealous, but I believe in zealotry, but not imposing it. I'm zealous upon myself. I stand on my principles, but I just won't force them on anyone else. So yeah.
Well,
So,
this is something that, of course, is entirely fine by me. I don't intend to. My views of the way we should live our lives on anybody else by force, and if we could all just agree that that's the way to do it, then it's fine. My wife and I come from radically different
yes.
backgrounds, more different than J.D. Vance and his wife. I don't think you can get more different than the world of Scottish Calvinism that I grew up in, and the world of Somali Islam that Ayan grew up in. But we have certainly found that it's been a wonderful and fruitful union. And I don't think our sons, Thomas and Campbell, have suffered from our heterogeneity as a couple. We'll see. The great thing about the human species is that it's capable of running a great many different experiments in how to live simultaneously. And indeed, it's good that we do, because that creates a kind of social biodiversity. I'm hostile to all projects to homogenize humanity, which is why I'm wary of the popularity of Taylor Swift. That nothing should be that popular. I want us to remain different. I want you to retain your way of life, your culture, your traditions. I think the world's enriched by them. And you've said the magic words. You don't want to force them on anybody. Christianity's worst feature was its desire to proselytize and then by force. It grew out of that. Islam has not yet grown out of that. But there's some reason to hope that it can, and that the different monotheistic religions can ultimately find a way of coexisting peacefully. I do think that that's conceivable, because we've already achieved so much between Christians and Jews.
You're right. So I'll take two brief questions from the audience. One question from the audience, and Amir is asking, how do you convert a Western atheistic, egotistic, self-centered society back to a God-centered society in which they will be committed to contribute their share to society and possibly sacrifice their life for the survival of their culture and society?
I think the answer to that is probably that such a society needs to be confronted by an existential threat. Ukraine is a country that I've spent a good deal of time in recently, and it's a striking thing that in the face of the barbaric Russian invasion and in the face of terrible casualties, Ukrainians have turned back to religion, and funerals are very often events in which there's a profound religious sense of grief. It's hard to imagine a really secularized, materialistic, narcissistic, egotistical society coming back to God without some traumatic shock. That seems to be the pattern of history. In World War I, it was felt in 1914 that there had already been significant secularization in Britain, in France, and in Germany. And as Jay Winter and others have shown, that the grief of loss that the war brought about brought a significant religious revival in all the competent countries.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. It was a pleasure. We will give the audience a link to your wife's book on reforming Islam. If I can remember the name, I do remember it's available online in PDF form. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure. And thank you.
The title of the book was is Heretic, if
exactly,
I remember
yes.
rightly.
Yes.
And,
So
it's one of a series of books, and I urge you to read them because there's nothing really more important, I think, for Jews in Israel, but for the world generally, than to see that there can be a path out of militant Islam. She was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood as a teenage girl, and her path out of that world and into a world of tolerance, but also a world of ultimately of Christian faith, is one of the most remarkable paths of our time. And the books are a very important contribution.
Yes.
And it's not often that somebody goes on a talk like this and sells somebody else's books, but I think if it's my wife, it's okay.
Yes, it's definitely legit. Very inspiring journey. Yes. So thank you very much for your time. Thank the Alam Shmaut podcast on Meaning for hosting us, and thank our audience for attending. Thank you very much. Good night.
Been a pleasure.
אם הגעתם עד לפה, כנראה אתם חושבים שהפרק היה ממש חשוב. אז יאללה, זה הזמן להפיץ בקבוצות, לחברים, ובכלל לעזור לציבור הישראלי להכיר יותר עובדות שחשובות להמשך קיומו. אז יאללה, לעבודה.